Okay, so my background, I'm primarily a psychiatrist, but I was a researcher in the philosophy department of King's College London for 12 years, and that's where my interest basically in the nature of mind, consciousness comes from. What I want to do today is to reflect on a specific kind of mystical experience that is well recognized by people that have taken psychedelics. It's described by people that are reasonably advanced meditators, but it also occasionally occurs in lay people as well in unusual situations. The key question that I really want to look at today is whether we can actually draw any metaphysical conclusions from the kinds of mystical experience that people report, whether these experiences actually tell us anything interesting or important about the nature of mind and reality, or whether we should just kind of dismiss these experiences as kind of unusual, strange things that happen to the brain, but they don't really have any further metaphysical implications. So I'm going to kind of structure the talk in this way. I'm just going to go through some descriptions of typical extrovertive mystical experiences. A lot of people have spoken about the neuroscience of psychedelics, meditation, mystical experience. I'll cover that very quickly. Then we will have a slightly technical middle section, but it's kind of important to get to the conclusions that I want to. So we are going to have to look at the philosophical mind-body problem. And we're going to have to look at the kinds of knowledge that we can ascertain through ordinary perception and through scientific inquiry. I want to look at the kinds of knowledge that mystical experience might provide to us and what the problem. And to round up, I'm just going to reflect on the so-called illusory nature of the self and think about the relationship, if any, between spirituality and philosophy. So this particular experience was famously discussed by Freud. It was called the peculiar oceanic feeling. It was also referred to by Walter Stace as the extrovertive mystical experience. And Robert Foreman has also described it as the unitive mystical state. So Freud actually borrowed the term oceanic feeling from Romain Rolland. And he was a disciple of the Indian mystic Ramakrishna. Rolland was a French dramatist, novelist, essayist. He was an art historian and a mystic, and he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1915. So he and Freud begin this correspondence in 1923, and Rolland is telling Freud an awful lot about his spirituality, his religion, and these mystical experiences that he encounters. And Freud's actually quite interested in this. So Freud later opens his famous essay, Civilization and Its Discontents, with a consideration of this oceanic feeling. So Freud reports on what Rolland described to him. He says that it's a sense of eternity, a feeling of something limitless, unbounded, as it were, oceanic. Interestingly, Freud says himself that he can find no trace of this oceanic feeling in himself. So rather than draw any wider metaphysical conclusions from the oceanic feeling, Freud actually attempts to use the framework of psychoanalysis to explain what's going on. And for Freud, the primitive ego is, in a sense, in an oceanic state in any case. As Freud says, the ego is originally all-inclusive, but later it separates off an external world from itself. The ideational content appropriate to it would be precisely those notions of limitlessness and oneness with the universe, the very notions used by my friend to elucidate the oceanic feeling. So this means that for Freud, the oceanic feeling is essentially an experience of psychological regression to an earlier stage of ego development. It's kind of interesting, Freud wasn't very tolerant of any perceived deviations of psychoanalysis in its early days into matter spiritual, and we know that Jung himself could recognize a very spiritual dimension to psychoanalytic investigation. And in Jungian psychology, there's an important recognition of the transpersonal domain. So if we come back to the oceanic feeling, it is an example of what Walter Stace in his seminal Mysticism and Philosophy referred to as an extrovertive mystical experience. The philosopher and meditator Robert Foreman calls this state a unitive mystical state. And actually, this extrovertive mystical state, it contrasts with what Stace called the introvertive mystical state. It's said that in the introvertive mystical state, there is no mental content whatsoever. There is no intentionality. The mind attaches to no object, which I find a very mysterious concept in itself. Foreman calls the introvertive mystical state a pure consciousness event. I'm going to set that aside. Stace describes the extrovertive mystical experience as having certain key features. So he says there's a unifying vision expressed abstractly by the formula, all is one. The one is, in extrovertive mysticism, perceived through the physical senses, in or through the multiplicity of objects. The more concrete apprehension of the one as being an inner subjectivity in all things, described variously as life or consciousness or a living presence, the discovery that nothing is really dead. There's a sense of objectivity or reality. There's a feeling of blessedness, joy, happiness, satisfaction. There's a feeling that what is apprehended is holy or sacred or divine. This is the quality that gives rise to the interpretation of the experience as being an experience of God. It's the specifically religious element in the experience. It's closely intertwined, but not identical with, the previously listed characteristic of blessedness and joy. There's paradoxicality, and it's alleged by mystics to be ineffable, incapable of being described in words, etc. So, as I say, I won't be looking into any metaphysical implications of the introvertive mystical experience, and from now on, all reference to mystical experience is really referring to the extrovertive type. So I thought these are quite interesting descriptions that I've found in the literature. I mean, extrovertive mystical experience, it's been variously described throughout history, actually, in the various religions. Descriptions go back hundreds, thousands of years. It's found in different cultures. This was an example of a Zen master that was actually given psilocybin in a laboratory setting. And he said, at the beginning, he had seen frightening faces and carnivalesque processions of ghosts. But he remembered the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the fact that such visions are a mere projection of the ego. Eventually, he turned to a simple mantra and began to focus his awareness on his breath. Thereby, he managed to free himself from this spooky spectacle and moved on to a higher state of consciousness, as he called it. He also thought of Buddha, and this further deepened his state of ego dissolution. He attained a much more profound insight into the fact that all existence was love, divine love, he specified, or even better, being. When reaching that state, he told us, I thought, this is it, the state he had sought during 3 decades of regular meditation exercises. In Mysticism and Philosophy, Stace gives this nice example of an acquaintance of his who he described as being philosophically trained. NM took Mescalin, and NM reported that the room looked out onto the backyards of a tenement. The buildings were decrepit and ugly, the ground covered with boards, rags, and debris. Suddenly, every object in my field of vision took on a curious, intense kind of existence of its own. That is, everything appeared to have an inside, to exist as I existed, having inwardness, a kind of individual life. And every object seen under this aspect appeared exceedingly beautiful. There was a cat out there with its head lifted, effortlessly watching a wasp that moved without moving just above its head. Everything was urgent with life, which was the same in the cat, the wasp, the broken bottles, and merely manifested itself differently in these individuals, which did therefore not cease to be individuals, however. All things seemed to glow with a light that came from within them. So I'll skip over this quickly. In the last few years, there has been a more detailed understanding of what's going on in the brains of individuals in meditative states or under the influence of psychedelic agents, and Robin Carhart-Harris gave much more up-to-date information on this morning. But it does help us to get some insights into what might be the neurological contribution to these extrovertive kinds of mystical states or experiences. So Judson Brewer and colleagues in 2011, they did an fMRI study of experienced meditators versus controls, and these people were engaged in concentration, loving kindness, and choiceless awareness meditation. So they found that across all mindfulness meditation conditions, the two primary modes of the default mode network, which we've heard a great deal about, the posterior cingulate cortex and the medium prefrontal cortex, were less active in meditators and controls. Finally, we observed distinct functional connectivity patterns in meditators that differed from controls and which were consistent across resting state baseline and meditation conditions. These results suggest that the neural mechanisms underlying mindfulness training are associated with differential activation and connectivity of the DMN. So this is Robin Carhart-Harris's work looking at the effects of psilocybin and again, significant effects in the DMN. It's known to be activated during self-referencing and other high-level functions linked to the self-construct. Moreover, DMN regions are important connector hubs. Such an integrative function would confer a significant responsibility on these regions, which may explain why their deactivation has such a profound effect on consciousness, as shown here. These studies offer the most detailed account to date on how the psychedelic state is produced in the brain. The results suggest decreased activity and connectivity in the brain's connector hubs, permitting an unconstrained style of cognition. So a key feature of both these studies, you'll see, is the relative deactivation of both the posterior cingulate and the medial prefrontal cortex. And I'll say again that the default mode network it's kind of conceived as being loosely equivalent to the ego. So these changes in the DMN might be the neurological underpinning of the experience of ego dissolution, which is so characteristic of psychedelic and mystical experience. Because during these experiences, there's such a radical shift in the experience of the relation between the individual's own mind and the external world, I think that mystical experience should be of interest to philosophers, particularly interested in the mind-body problem, or in a more contemporary sense, we might call it the mind-matter problem. So Descartes is often seen as the first modern philosopher that kind of triggers the mind-body problem debate in its current form. What Descartes famously said was that, on the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself, insofar as I am simply a thinking, non-extended thing, that is, a mind. And on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of body, insofar as this thing is simply an extended, non-thinking thing. And accordingly, it's certain that I am really distinct from my body and can exist without it. So it kind of appears to Descartes that mind and matter are two different substances, and that each could easily exist without the other. This view has come to be called Cartesian dualism. And really, Cartesian dualism, it kind of opens up a breach between an interior mental domain and what's called the Cartesian subject and the exterior physical world. And really, in a way, Cartesian dualism has kind of created a fundamental breach between mind and matter that subsequent philosophy has never really quite managed to repair. If we kind of move on to the German idealist philosopher Kant, he kind of generates a further worry about the subject and his relationship to the world. And this is the worry that external reality is actually fundamentally unknowable by the subject. So Kant's claim in his critique of pure reason is that the only data that the mind really has available is the way in which it is affected by things in the external world. The mind is receptive, but the mind cannot know the nature of the things that cause it to be affected. So Kant famously said, the receptivity of our mind, its power of receiving representations, insofar as it is affected in any way, is to be called sensibility. Our nature is so constituted that our intuition can never be other than sensible. That is, it contains only the way in which we are affected by objects. So if you look at the standard story of visual perception, you have light, which is reflected by an object. It enters the eye, signals pass up the optic nerve, complex brain processes produce a representation. And the point is that what we're actually in direct contact with is the representation in here, not the thing out there that caused the representation. And for Kant, we can't actually traverse this causal chain to experience the world directly. So in a way, the real world is hidden from view. The world is a hidden thing in itself. So this idea that we can't gain full epistemic access to the thing in itself has been described as epistemic humility. I think by David Lewis coined that term. And epistemic humility seems to apply on this Kantian view to perception of the world, but actually we find a parallel problem in science as well. So if we return again to Descartes and the idea that the stuff of the mind is somehow fundamentally different to the stuff of everyday physical objects, we find that historically everyday objects are much easier to study for science, which is grounded in the public domain. Science requires that scientists can agree and verify public observations using publicly agreed scientific methods. And this has tended to mean that science has neglected the interior domain of subjective experience, and instead becomes predominantly interested in the world of exterior objects. So for science, the model of the world is based on objective agreement about the way things causally interact and affect each other. It's a model really essentially of structural relations between things rather than what those things might be like in their interiors or in themselves. So this structuralist approach in science it's very apparent in the theories of physics. In physics, any entity, maybe an electron, tends to be fully characterized by the way it causally interacts with other entities. But physics tends to be relatively silent about what an electron might be as a thing in itself. I mean, a very everyday way of thinking about this is in terms of interiority and exteriority. So you can think of the way you know your own mind. You seem to know the interior of your mind in a way that's not available to other people. This is called subjectivity. By contrast, you cannot access the interiority of other people's minds. So you infer that other people have an interiority like your own, but that's based on external evidence, such as their speech and behavior. In terms of other people, we really only have access to their exteriority, which is, in a way, it's the same as saying that we only know them objectively. So just like other people's minds, science also seems to provide us only with the exteriority of things like electrons. What science completely overlooks is what the interiority of an electron might be. And this kind of leads me to a first key question that I want to ask in this talk, which is, what is the nature of the physical world as a thing in itself? Going back to the mind-body problem, this is a more contemporary formulation by the philosopher Howard Robinson. He says that humans have, or seem to have, both physical properties and mental properties. People have, or seem to have, the sort of properties attributed in the physical sciences. These physical properties include size, weight, shape, color, motion through space and time, etc. But they also have, or seem to have, mental properties, which we do not attribute to typical physical objects. These properties involve consciousness, including perceptual experience, emotional experience, and much else, intentionality, including beliefs, desires, and much else, and they are possessed by a subject or a self. The mind-body problem concerns the relationship between these two sets of properties. Some of you might know Frank Jackson's celebrated now thought experiment about Mary, the neuroscientist, which really highlights particular issues and problems about knowledge in relation to subjectivity and objectivity. So in Jackson's thought experiment, Mary is a super intelligent neuroscientist who knows absolutely everything there is to know about the physical facts of the experience of seeing color. There is no relevant physical fact in whatever branch of science, whether that's neuroscience or physics, that she does not possess. However, she's in the unusual situation of having been raised from birth in a black and white environment, and for the entire duration of her life, she's never had the experience of seeing color. So one day Mary is released from her room, and she is allowed to see a ripe tomato. So it seems to be the case that no matter how much Mary learns about the physical facts of color vision, when she actually has the experience of seeing red, something additional about the nature of reality is revealed to her. We might say that she comes to know the interiority of the experience of seeing red, as well as the physical facts, or the exteriority. But notice also that this additional interior knowledge, it doesn't require any additional propositional thinking. She doesn't require any additional sentences that might be part of a theory. I mean, she might have propositional thought like, oh, so this is what it's like to see red, but she doesn't need to have that thought in order to have the experience. So this has generated an enormous amount of literature in philosophy, what sense we are to make of this thought experiment. But I just want to underline two key points, really. And the first one is that it seems that in order to have this insight into the interiority of the experience of seeing red, Mary doesn't change her propositional thinking. What she does is she changes the thing that thinks. When she sees red, there's a physical change to the structure of her brain that is the change that occurs when one sees red. No matter how clever or extensive her thoughts about seeing red, before the actual experience, this aspect of reality was not available to her. The second point really starts to bear down on what David Chalmers has called the hard problem of consciousness. And even though Mary has the experience of seeing red, something will still remain a mystery. And the mystery is this: why does this particular brain state, whether described in terms of neuroscience or physics, produce this particular experience? Why does seeing the ripe tomato feel like anything at all? So, put another way, how is it that the particular set of objective facts is associated with this particular subjective experience? And this leads to the second key question that I want to raise, which is the hard problem. How does exteriority produce interiority? Okay, last bit of technical philosophy. In thinking about the hard problem of consciousness, I kind of want to draw on Ken Wilber's four-quadrant model. And for Wilber, there are four basic dimensions to consciousness. The quadrants are divided up with respect to interiority and exteriority, and singularity or plurality. So on the left-hand side are the interior aspects of consciousness, and in the singular, we have singular conscious experiences, which might be Mary's experience of seeing a ripe tomato. In the plural are the intersubjective states of consciousness. And this might be the shared kind of intersubjective space between a psychotherapist and a patient in a session. So on the right-hand side, we have the exterior aspects of consciousness. And in the singular case, well, this might be one of these fMRI studies looking at what happens when you take a psychedelic. And in this lower right quadrant, these exterior facts are collective social facts. You know, what is it about socioeconomic situations that influence ideology and might influence collective consciousness as well? So one way to kind of, I think traditionally philosophers they're trying to understand what it is about the upper right quadrant that's creating these inner experiences in the upper left quadrant. And my initial observation is that kind of based on this four-quadrant model, it might be missing the point, actually, because Wilber's saying that consciousness is analyzable or is a function of all these four quadrants, and no particular quadrant we should think of as producing another one. So on the four-quadrant model, before having the experience of seeing a ripe tomato, Mary's kind of over here. She only has knowledge of the upper right quadrants, and then after the experience of seeing red, she also has knowledge of this quadrant here, the upper left quadrant. Because of a change in her brain state, there's a way in which her consciousness becomes expanded, and reality is revealed to her in a radically new way. However, what still remains a mystery to Mary is how these two quadrants are related. She can't understand the relationship between the exterior and the interior facts. This brings me to my main point of the talk. What I'm suggesting is I think it's possible that mysticism and psychedelics may induce an experience that has far more radical implications in terms of knowledge than the experience that Mary has. So following Wilber's model, I think that in the extrovertive mystical experience, there seems to be a kind of dissolving or transcending of both the concepts of number along this axis and of interiority and exteriority along this axis. I think that these boundaries, in a way, kind of dissolve. So there's this transcending, and it seems that in the mystical experience, all four quadrants in Wilber's model seem to be seamlessly bound together. So if you recall that in the unitive mystical state, it feels as if consciousness becomes boundless, that all things are somehow made of the same mind-like stuff. Again, as Stace described it, apprehension of the one as being an inner subjectivity in all things, described variously as life or consciousness or a living presence, the discovery that nothing is really dead. So this view that the interior of all things is actually mind-like, and I mean literally the interior of an electron, anything you want to think of, that the interior is somehow mind-like or consciousness or awareness. It's a philosophical doctrine called Panpsychism. So actually, Panpsychism offers a simple and elegant solution to our two main questions. So in terms of the physical world, what might be the thing in itself? Well, the answer is the thing in itself is essentially mind-like, some form of primitive awareness. Consciousness literally is everywhere. How does exteriority produce interiority? Well, when you think about it, it's not really a valid question. Interiority is already everywhere. Consciousness is already in all things. So I'm just going to finish off now. I want to quickly reflect on this illusory nature of the self. In Extrovertive Mystical Experience, insight largely follows the dissolution of the self. And the subject is really reflexive. It's a form of folding process. So Sartre expressed this as a reflective consciousness reflecting on a reflected consciousness. Or we could say that awareness has awareness of awareness. In psychedelic and mystical experience, there is an unfolding of this reflexive subject, and psychedelics and mystical experience can involve a kind of unfolding which helps dissolve the illusion of a separate self and leads to a direct experience of a continuous field of consciousness or awareness, also called the One. And this kind of mystical experience, there's also an interesting twist to the kind of position of Mysterianism. So Colin McGinn famously says that human brains simply aren't built to resolve the mind-body problem because we don't have the cognitive apparatus to do that. He says it's a bit like a gorilla sitting down and trying to figure out how life arises out of matter. The gorilla is cognitively closed. It's just not got the equipment to solve that problem. So mystical experience kind of suggests a possibility that ordinarily our brains are cognitively closed to understanding the relationship between mind and matter, but by changing the function of our brains, whether through psychedelics or meditation, then previously unavailable insights are possible. So the point is, it's not to change our thinking as such, but it's to change the thing that thinks. Very nearly finished. De Quincey, when he was talking about trying to understand the philosophy of Whitehead, he says that speaking for myself, I understand Whitehead best when I allow myself to embody his concepts, to feel them preverbally, to let them take root in my cells. So there is an extra rational somatic component to the mind-body solution. You have to feel it in your body as well as think it in your mind, which is perhaps what we should have expected all along. After all, it is the mind-body problem. I'm aware that this sounds more like a spiritual exercise than conventional philosophical discourse. And the notion of bringing a spiritual dimension into philosophy will sound very alien to modern ears. But Pierre Hadot has described how in ancient philosophy, spiritual exercises were fundamental. As Hadot has said, ancient philosophy proposed to mankind an art of living. By contrast, modern philosophy appears above all as a construction of a technical jargon reserved for specialists, which I've clearly demonstrated. Ever since I started doing philosophy, I've always believed that philosophy was a concrete act, which changed our perception of the world and our life, not the construction of a system. It is a life, not a discourse. So just to conclude, I do think that mystical experience might lead to important metaphysical insights into the nature of mind and reality. These insights are extra-rational. It's not a matter of changing your thinking, but changing the thing that thinks. Your brain, your body, maybe psychedelics and meditation do that. And finally, I think philosophers of mind should try meditation or maybe eat more mushrooms. Thank you very much.